I'm David Spring with the Washington Family Rights Coalition. This is the first of 12 sessions presented at the FTC workshop on July 9th, 2025. In this session, we hear from Andrew Ferguson, the chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission, announcing that the Federal Trade Commission is beginning an investigation of the trans drug cult and is gathering evidence that the trans drug cult has been falsely claiming the trans drugs are safe and effective, when in fact they are severely harmful, and trans cult victims are not being warned about this harm. Here's the announcement from Federal Trade Commissioner Andrew Ferguson.
Please welcome to the stage the Chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Andrew Ferguson.
Good morning. Welcome to the Federal Trade Commission. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, John, for that introduction. Just over a year ago, the New York Times reported that the Biden administration had pressured the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, to remove age minimum requirements for cross-sex hormones and other sex change surgeries from their forthcoming guidelines on the care of transgender youth. Why did the Biden administration object to age minimum requirements? According to emails provided to the New York Times and the state of Alabama in its suit against the Biden administration, the Biden health agencies worried that including minimum age requirements in the guidelines would, quote, result in devastating legislation for trans care, end quote. The Biden administration's concern was not that age minimum requirements were unscientific, unreasonable, or unhelpful to doctors, therapists, parents, and children experiencing gender dysphoria. Science was beside the point. Instead, their concern was political. They worried that age minimum requirements gave too much ammunition to critics of gender-affirming care. The Biden administration didn't care about the parents and kids who might have relied on those requirements when deciding whether to consent to expensive hormone treatments and sex change surgeries. They didn't care about the parents and kids who might have been spared a lifetime of pain and regret if their doctors, therapists, and surgeons had observed those requirements. They cared about politics. They didn't care about people. Today, by contrast, is not about politics. It's about the parents and kids the Biden administration chose to ignore. It's about our nation's children who stand most in need of our love, protection, and support. It's about their parents whose selfless and fruitful love is the foundation of our nation and of every nation. It is about caring for the most vulnerable among us and protecting them from manipulation, deception, and abuse. It is about healing the wounds that proponents of gender-affirming care may have inflicted on our nation's children and parents and preventing the potential for future harm. Today is about people, not politics. So I want to focus on some of the courageous young people we have with us today. While each person's story is unique, and you will hear from them, they do share some features in common, and I want to highlight those features because they speak to recurring patterns of potential deception in gender-affirming care. As chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Congress has entrusted me with protecting citizens from deceptive acts and practices, and one of the reasons we are here today is examine whether some of the practices in gender-affirming care are deceptive and require greater scrutiny by the FTC. Let's start with Prisha Mosley. You will hear from Prisha herself, at 14 years old, was a victim of sexual assault. By age 16, she suffered depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anorexia. After a concerning episode of self-harm, a pediatrician was recommended to help Prisha address her eating disorder. After a brief consultation, the pediatrician concluded that Prisha was actually a boy and recommended a therapist specializing in transgender care. Prisha recalls that the therapist assured Prisha that she could cure her depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anorexia by making her body more masculine through testosterone injections. Just a few months later, Prisha secured a letter from a mental health counselor stating that the surgical removal of her breasts was a clinical necessity. 1 month later, Prisha's breasts were removed. What had begun 2 years earlier as a referral to a pediatrician for treatment of anorexia ended on a surgeon's table and the removal of her breasts. Claire Abernathy will describe her similar experience. After experiencing a traumatic sexual assault, she began identifying as a boy when she was just 11 years old. A year later, she met with a therapist who specialized in transgender care. Claire explains that this therapist recommended that she realize her male identity through hormone injections and sex change surgeries. Although Claire's mother was not confident in this diagnosis, she was told that affirming Claire's identity as a boy was necessary to prevent Claire from committing suicide. The takeaway for Claire's mother was clear. The only way to heal Claire, the therapist explained, was to take the chemical and surgical steps necessary to make Claire's body more masculine. And so it happened that in the summer following her 8th grade graduation, Claire's breasts were removed. Soren Aldako, too, identified as a boy when she was just 11 years old, although she did so at the instigation of an older girl she met online. 4 years later, Soren had a severe mental health breakdown that required hospitalization. There, she met a psychiatrist who Soren recalls told her that transitioning to become a boy was a medically legitimate form of treatment for mental health challenges. After a short appointment, Soren was prescribed testosterone. After a year of testosterone, social isolation brought on by government-mandated COVID lockdowns, and a difficult breakup, Soren decided she wanted to remove her breasts. Although Soren's therapist knew Soren had expressed reservations about this, she still wrote a letter recommending the surgical removal of her breasts. $25,000 later, Soren's breasts were removed. These are not stories of liberation, but of desperation. After years of intense mental health struggles, these girls and their parents were looking for any path that might lead them to genuine healing. And they encountered physicians, therapists, and surgeons who purported to provide them with one. Their pitch was simple. The children's problems were not due to the trauma of sexual assault, depression, or anorexia. Instead, the real problem was the fact that they were boys trapped in girls' bodies. Taking chemical and surgical steps necessary to look more like a boy would relieve their symptoms. But they weren't cured. Indeed, their mental health continuously declined over the course of their treatment. By the time they realized that their medical transition had not solved their mental health issues, permanent and irreversible changes had been made to their bodies. They say they were never informed that testosterone injections would affect permanent changes in their voices, their faces, their hormone levels, and their fertility. Far from making them whole, this gender-affirming care left them, in the words of Prisha, quote, broken, with extreme physical injuries and without their body parts. Unfortunately, these stories are common. The path to puberty blockers, hormone injections, and sex change surgery often begins with a young person struggling with various mental health issues who recently underwent a personal crisis. At a loss for how to help their child, helpless parents seek the advice of medical specialists who believe they will provide objective, evidence-based guidance. After a brief meeting with the child, these specialists may proclaim that his or her problems can be solved by undergoing a medical transition. Parents may be told they should affirm their children's identity lest they put their child at a greater risk of suicide. Parents are thus confronted with a terrifying choice: either consent to gender-affirming care or their child may die. As one of the most public champions of these therapies exclaimed more than a decade ago, quote, "We often ask parents, would you rather have a dead son than a live daughter?" End quote. Confronted with this terrifying choice, parents sometimes are told that puberty blockers will give their child time to think and make an informed decision about transitioning. What parents often aren't told, however, is that puberty blockers don't delay puberty, they suppress it entirely, and that most children on puberty blockers move on to sex hormone injections. In such cases, puberty blockers do not buy a child or his parents time to think. They are a gateway drug to a lifetime of expensive hormone injections and sex change surgeries. The stories we will hear today paint a troubling picture. Lured by the promise of a fail-safe cure for their mental health problems and kept in the dark about the permanent and irreversible effects of medical transitioning, these young people and their parents say they were coaxed to open their minds, their hearts, and their wallets to the miraculous healing powers of puberty blockers, hormone injections, and sex change surgeries. There is only one problem. It isn't true. And that isn't me saying it. That is a quote from The Atlantic, written by the same reporter who previously accused the Trump administration of carrying out a nasty campaign on this issue. Europeans have a few decades of empirical experience to offer us on this. A 2024 report on gender identity services commissioned by the UK's National Health Service, called the Cass Report after its author, found no evidence to support the claim that puberty blockers improved a child's body image or gender dysphoria, no evidence to support the claim that gender-affirming treatment or sex hormone injections reduce a child's risk of suicide, and no evidence to support the claim that social transition in children led to positive mental health outcomes. Most importantly, the report did not find sufficient evidence to support the claim that gender-affirming care, puberty blockers, or sex hormone injections had a positive effect on the psychological well-being of patients. The report criticized many of the most popular clinical guidelines for recommending medical transition in spite of insufficient evidence about the risks and benefits of medical treatment in adolescents, particularly in relation to long-term outcomes. More specifically, the Cass report notes that the most influential clinical guideline, published by WPATH, overstates the strength of evidence in recommending medical transition for adolescent children. The shocking disjunction between the science behind these treatments and the claims made about them is hardly limited to Europe. Just last year, the New York Times ran a lengthy expose about how one of the leading advocates of these treatments refused to publish the results of a nearly 10-year study that suggested that, quote, puberty blockers do not lead to mental health improvements in children diagnosed with dysphoria, end quote. She refused to publish the studies of her results because she worried they might provide support to state governments who were regulating this care. You heard me right. She refused to publish the results of her scientific study because of her politics. This disjunction played out before the Supreme Court of the United States just months ago. During oral arguments in the United States against Skrmetti, the Biden administration's Solicitor General attacked Tennessee's regulation of gender-affirming care for children because it failed to, quote, take into account the significant health benefits that can come from providing gender-affirming care, including reduced suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, end quote. But just a few minutes later, the lawyer representing the private plaintiffs attacking the law made a shocking admission in response to Justice Samuel Alito's question about the Cass report. Quote, there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide, end quote. This had been the whole premise behind the push for gender-affirming care, a choice between hormones and sex-change surgery or suicide. But there is no evidence to support that premise. Indeed, the state of Alabama's brief filed in the same case revealed in gruesome details the lengths to which the Biden administration went to deny this reality for fear of political consequences. Now, why does all of this matter to the Federal Trade Commission? As chairman, I am not charged with passing moral judgment on anyone's ideology, lifestyle, or medical choices. I am charged, however, with protecting my fellow citizens from unfair or deceptive trade practices. And experience has taught us that the more vulnerable the population, the more likely they are to be targeted with deception. For example, people who suffer from chronic or terminal diseases are more prone to be deceived by healthcare scams. Taking advantage of their desperation, modern snake oil salesmen promise them the moon, an affordable and scientifically proven cure that will succeed where all conventional medical treatments have failed. Of course, the cure is not scientifically proven to be effective. The salesman just presents it as though it were. The FTC statutory mandate is to protect vulnerable people from deceptive claims about health and cures. Now, I have heard it argued that the Commission ought not to address today's topic at all because the Commission does not regulate the practice of medicine and because the topic is politically controversial. Both arguments are categorically wrong and I reject them. First, the FTC is the federal government's guardian against false and deceptive health claims. We have brought dozens of enforcement actions against false and misleading health claims, from shyster snake oil salesmen to powerful pharmaceutical companies. We have won actions against individuals selling everyday herbs and spices as cures to cancer, organizations overstating the effectiveness of their products in preventing COVID-19, and medical centers making unsubstantiated claims about their efficacy in treating chronic diseases. Time and time again, we have enforced the FTC Act against businesses and individuals who have made claims about their health products and services that were not backed by scientific evidence. Just last year, We want a judgment against a company that, quote, tricked people who needed real help into buying expensive and unproven stem cell therapy, end quote. This was a deceptive medical cure aimed at vulnerable people, the elderly and the disabled. We want another judgment against the makers of a popular supplement who made claims about the mental health effects of the supplement, quote, without competent and reliable scientific evidence, end quote. It's taken directly from the district court judgment in that case. The Biden administration's chief consumer protection enforcer publicly warned after the victory that, quote, companies should take note and remember that health claims need to be backed up by reliable scientific evidence, end quote. I agree. The Biden administration FTC also put out 40 pages of guidance on what the FTC Act requires for businesses making health claims, noting that the FTC Act applies to all claims about medical products and cures, and that claims that consumers cannot easily assess on their own must meet an incredibly high standard of scientific substantiation. The issue we address today is no different than the health claims we have addressed for many decades. Second, I acknowledge that many people feel passionately about this issue. But if a medical claim is false or misleading, it is the Commission's sworn duty to protect American citizens from that claim no differently than it would for any other false or misleading claim. Refusing to investigate these health claims and the potential consumer harm to parents and children merely because one political party supports those claims as a matter of its ideology would be the politicized choice. And that is why we are here today, to ensure that parents and children seeking professional help in a period of intense distress do not make potentially life-altering choices under veil of deception, misinformed about the risks and benefits of gender-affirming care. We are not here to pass judgment on anyone. We are here to ensure that those who make claims about gender-affirming care are held to the same standard we apply to everyone else who engages in commerce. We are here to ensure that everyone can make an informed choice about their own path to healing without fear of being deceived by those who stand to profit from certain medical interventions. Considering our common goal today, I want to outline briefly the FTC's perspective on what counts as a deceptive trade act or practice. For an act or practice to be deceptive, it must satisfy three elements. First, the act or practice must be likely to mislead the consumer, and this can be done either through commission, for example, making a false or misleading claim, or through omission, for example, failing to disclose certain information that would prevent a claim from being misleading to a reasonable consumer. Second, the act or practice must be likely to mislead a reasonable consumer acting in similar circumstances. In the case of acts or practices that target specific groups, for example, children or vulnerable parents, the test is whether the act is likely to mislead a reasonable member of that specific population. And third, the act or practice must be material to the consumer's decision to purchase the service. For example, if a child or his or her parents would not have chosen puberty blockers had they been aware of the risks associated with those drugs, the omission of this fact by medical practitioners may be considered material. The purpose of today's workshop, then, is clear. The FTC must understand what sorts of claims are being made about these treatments, what sort of science supports them, what the risks associated with those treatments are, and whether vulnerable populations may have been subject to deception in the administration of these treatments. They are the same sorts of questions we would ask about any health claim, no matter how politically charged. Americans have a right to health claims substantiated by reliable scientific evidence. They have a right to be informed about information that would be material to their decision to accept hormone therapies or sex change surgeries. The FTC's mandate is to protect those rights in this context as it does in every other healthcare context. While not everyone who undergoes gender-affirming care will necessarily experience the same painful loss and regret that Prisha, Claire, and Soren have experienced, every young boy and girl, every concerned parent and guardian has the right to be informed of all the material information about the risks of these procedures. I promise that our agency will do everything in its power to achieve that end. Finally, a brief note on what comes next. Following the conclusion of today's workshop, the Commission will issue a public request for information on the various topics that we are discussing today. We will issue it sometime next week after we have had time to digest everything we learned today and can tailor our request for information based on what we learn. The public will have 60 days to respond to that request, and I encourage every single person here to submit a response. We will also provide a mechanism for individual members of the public to submit information they wish the Commission to keep confidential. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to today's conversations.